say a few words about that? I mean, is that connected?
Well, no, that's the basic notion that somehow our future lies in our past.
Right.
And shamanism, well, the particular past that I wanted to concentrate on was this period of time after the melting of the last glacier 20,000 years ago, and for the 10,000 years following that, when there were pastoral populations in Africa and leaving Africa that had ecological balance and this shamanic doorway to nature. See, at every, oh, the computer isn't here, but at every glaciation, human populations were bottled up in Africa during the time when the ice pack was thick. Nobody was getting out. But only the last time were the people, was pastoralism developed in the intervening period. So it was 20,000 years ago, those people leaving Africa were herders of domesticated cattle, and all previous radiations out of Africa had been hunter-gatherers. Yeah, the Minoan civilization, see, Çatalhöyük ended in 6500 BC, but what's interesting is this is when you get the earliest Minoan settlements, and they carry the pottery motifs and building styles of central Anatolia to Crete. So it appears that what happened was Çatalhöyük was like the last outpost of this goddess culture, and when these wheeled chariot Indo-European folks came down, the survivors of that actually went to Crete, and Crete became this weird institutionalized backwater where literally for 3 millennia the fossilized social forms of the previous matrilineal society were kept intact, while on Asia Minor, on the mainland, it all became about kingship, male lines of descent, and all that. It wasn't actually until that turning point at the top of the wave in 980 BC that the last vestiges of this goddess culture were crushed in Crete. And even then, you see the strain of mystical, of deep psychedelic mysticism that enters Greek religion is all imported from Crete. The northern Thracian strain in Greek religion is rational and airy and oriented toward physical space, but out of Crete came, rites 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years old, and it was always said, even up until classical times, that the rites that were celebrated in secret at Eleusis were celebrated openly at Heracleion and at Gnosis. So that's the connection. My fantasy about all this is, you see, Çatalhöyük represents such an advanced civilization over anything else existing that, and it can be traced back 1,000 years to Jericho. The people who built Jericho built a round tower there that was the absolute glory of the engineering world of 8,000 BC. And it was a grain storage tower. But then these Jericho people, it's hard to trace where they came from. What I think happened is that when you look at the stratigraphy of the Nile Valley, you discover that actually there weren't people in the Nile Valley much before 10,500 BC. Then suddenly these people appear who are called Natufean, and they build under the overhanging lips of cliffs and have a certain style of fetal burial in a honey pot and certain other characteristics, Natufeans, and they appear out of nowhere. Well, anybody who's studied them has wanted to connect them to the culture of old Europe that Maria Gimbutas talks about, simply based on the fact that they were so culturally advanced that the bias of all these scholars is to say, well, they must have come from the Balkans. But when you look at them as a cultural horizon, you see, to my mind, that they are unmistakably African. And that when you go to the Tesseli Plateau in southern Algeria, you find the same style of building, of living under the lips of caves, and this same coarse-grained black pottery called Sudanese ware. The pottery, the animal motifs, the fixation on the vulture, the jackal, and the cow, these are all African animals that occur at Chatal, seems to suggest that there was actually a sweep of African civilization and out of Africa into the Middle East around 10,000 BC. And these people built Jericho 1,000 years after that and settled southern Anatolia 1,000 years after that. Well, this is what this suggests then is that you could go out to the Tesseli Plateau with sufficient resources and conduct an archaeological survey, and the ultimate payoff in this fantasy is that you would unearth the archaeological equivalent of Eden. In other words, you would discover the Ur spot from which the Chatal civilization came, the site of this mushroom-using goddess cattle civilization. And when you read the accounts of the Tesseli Plateau, there's every reason to think that this strategy would work. It's a windswept sandstone escarpment, and Henri Flotte, who did the preliminary exploration out there, said that in these arroyos where the sand has been cleared away by the wind, there would be Neolithic stone chippings and detritus, sometimes up to half a meter thick, indicating, thousands and thousands of years of continuous habitation when this was all green. There is an enormous unexcavated tell out there that has never been dated, that is just carried on the archaeological surveys as presumed pre-Islamic. It's enormous. So digging out there might be a very useful thing to do. It's from that area that we get these 9,000-year-old images of shamans with mushrooms sprouting out of their bodies, shamans carrying mushrooms over their heads and running in long chains with strange geometric motifs trailing along beside them. So it would be a kind of recovery. I think archaeology will play a big role in the Archaic revival, that part of our cultural dilemma and our political infantilism comes from the fact that we don't know any history. So we're easily led, and we don't even really understand the history of the 20th century. I mean, you ask somebody who Joseph Goebbels was, and they think he served in the Nixon cabinet. And so hardly to speak of who was Suleiman the Magnificent and just exactly what was Frederick Barbarossa's role in European history and so forth and so on. But recovering this is like waking up, gaining control. And I said yesterday, it's only been 1,500 generations of people that have walked us into this dilemma. But the Archaic revival is a huge paradigm shift. You can imagine, remember the example I gave about the shift from the Renaissance, from the medieval to the Renaissance, which really was a giving up of the universal power of the church, the philosophical certitude of giving your allegiance to the Holy Father in Rome, and setting out into, the pure existential universe. I mean, Marcello Ficino said man is to be the measure of all things. Well, this sounds like old hat in 1990, but in 1480, this was such a dizzying notion that it can hardly be imagined. Giordano Bruno went to the stake was burned at the stake for insisting that the universe was infinite in all directions. He said, no, the stars and planets go on to infinity. And they just said, this is off the wall. Only a demon could inspire a thought like this. But the transition that we're asked to make, that was a transition, you see, from the certitude of dogma to secular existentialism. The transition that we're being asked to make is somewhat similar, but to my mind, deeper, more challenging, more profound. It's the shift from scientific certitude to a complete embracing of non-closure, to actually begin. It's a kind of maturity. What we're being asked to do is to grow up and realize that, there ain't no free lunch. There aren't always happy endings. Not every story ends with the German Shepherd running in and licking Grandpa's face and everybody laughing, and so forth and so on. Hard truths. And this lack of closure thing, I feel it in myself. And I assume, that ontogeny recapitulates and so forth, so that, the struggle to become a real human being is the struggle to give up having it actually make any sense, ultimately. Where I think it was, of all people, Robert Frost who said, the secret of a happy life is learning to enjoy people you don't approve of. Well, there's something, what that means is you're surrendering to life. You're just saying, it's bigger than I am. I may not like drag queens, but there they are, and I should get used to it. I should make the adjustment. This kind of thing. In other words, recognizing the complexity of the situation. And science has been like a centuries-long bender to exorcise precisely this kind of uncertainty from life. And, to reduce it all to atoms blindly running under the control of mathematically describable fields of force. The problem is, all the higher order phenomena, sociological, political, aesthetic, human organizational, got shoved off to one side and just sort of festered there for a long time while technology perfected itself, mass production, mass media, information transfer, but the human dimension lagged. And now there is this tremendous imbalance between the technological descriptive power of the culture and its moral and ethical power to direct itself toward any kind of rational goal. Well, when this happens in a society, or even in a personality, you can sort of make a Jungian model of this, you get what's called compensatory phenomena, or at least that's what it used to be called, means eruptions of material from the unconscious that is organized and constellated like a message, like an attention-claiming thing. In a person, in a personality, it ruptures as a symptom. It may be an attention-getting symptom to then bring other people into the caregiving loop or something like that. In a society like our own, a scientific society, it takes the form of the irrational appearing in strange forms. A good example of this in the past is the birth of Christianity in the center of the late Roman Empire, or the early Middle Roman Empire, where, the people who were administering the world at that time were Romans educated by Greeks who were Epicurean atomists, not Platonists, not followers of Heraclitus or Pythagoras or any of the flashy folks we're into. They were Democritean atomists, rationalists, materialists, would have been very comfortable in a modern chemical engineering company. And they could not conceive that the irrational could hold any threat to their world. Meanwhile, they had dark-skinned servants in the kitchens and in the gardens, Jews, Greeks, Phoenicians, people brought from the Eastern Mediterranean. And among these people, specifically the Jews, this rumor began to tear loose about a Galilean politician who had somehow tweaked the Romans and then risen from the dead. Well, any Roman administrator listening to his illiterate cook or gardener babble out this story would just, think, these folks is getting stranger every day. But what was actually happening, was a message was being enunciated which within 50 years would be hammering at the gate, well, make it 90 years, would be hammering at the gates of Rome with all the power of an invading army. In a similar way, the kinds of eruptions from the unconscious that characterize the 20th century are trying to serve a similar function. Well, I don't know where you want to put it, but like, for instance, the eruption of the beast man in the episodes of persecution that happened in Europe during the 20th century, persecution of Jews and Gypsies and Slavs. This, was tremendously shocking to the sensibilities of so-called civilized people, because people said, my God, we thought that ended with Frederick Barbarossa, or we thought that ended with Nero. How can 20th century people, the neatly clipped and manicured cities of prosperous intellectual Germany, how could it spawn a thing like this? Well, the answers are complex and multi-leveled, but from a very broad perspective, what is happening is the unconscious is erupting into history, leaping onto the stage of history, claiming the undivided attention of people in a way that surrealism, which was a limp-wristed artistic movement by comparison to fascism, never could. Similarly, you get that under control. The beast is supposedly suppressed by making, notice, a pact with a greater beast, that a demon can be summoned from the heart of matter with the purpose of wasting the cities of Germany, but then it arrives too late for that, but then it's good for the Japanese. So it's this opera about how evil begets greater evil, and people are reaching for ever greater weapons. Then the intrusion of the atomic bomb into history sort of halts that cycle. Everyone stands back and goes for a middle-class existence, and suddenly the skies of the planet are filled with the craft of meddling extraterrestrials who are obligingly dying in the desert and turning up on blocks of ice for Eisenhower to inspect, and all, this whole crazy story. Well, clearly what this is, the unconscious will not go away in the 20th century. Now the wheat fields of England lay down in hieroglyphic patterns to try and shake awake the dreaming primates. It's as though the whole of nature, is infused with a linguistic intent to communicate. I think this is one of the things you learn on psychedelics, that everything has a story, everything has a lesson, and it's not abstract or remote or removed. To the degree that you can hold your ego aside, nature can teach you almost anything you want to know. You can learn hydrology by staring into a mud puddle, it is all happening right there. But ego is a very subtly interfering factor. I always think, in my own experience at one time in the Amazon when I was at my most illuminated, I could walk into the jungle and invite butterflies to come down and settle on my outstretched hands, like St. Francis of Assisi, you know. And I would do this, and it would bring tears of joy and affirmation to my eyes, and then it would go on, and the tears of joy and affirmation would clear from my eyes, and in the midst of this pure, unadulterated ecstasy, a tiny thought would form, which was, wouldn't it be nice to show this to somebody else so they could see how great I am? So then, you know, I scurry back to the camp, gather up a skeptical colleague, bring them back to the clearing, and march out into the clearing with outstretched hands to just have nothing happen, except people just turn away in just... My God, you know, what an embarrassment you've become. That it's all going to end like this. Better you should be eaten by termites. It's a better story. So, you know, it's weird. I mean, Tao is like that. You can't push it. You can't use it. Somebody asked me once, was I worried that the mushroom could be used for evil somehow? And actually, early on, this occurred to me, and I put it to the mushroom. And it basically said, you know, you can't grasp it. It isn't even there if you have wrong intent. You can't even perceive it. It's very selective. And it must be so, because one of the puzzles for me, being in the communication business, is how it spreads, how the tree of information spreads, where it's tolerated, where it's repressed, where it's embraced. It's very interesting. You may have noticed mushrooms get extraordinary good press, or none at all. Even in the height of drug war hysteria, the image of mushrooms is largely neutral, unformed in any direction, otherwise viewed as rather comical, harmless, humorous. It is somehow hardwired into our consciousness, connected into an archetype that we are inherently friendly toward as primates. Probably this has to do with this deep food programming that went on for a long, long time. We literally cannot bite the hand that feeds us. So we have a kind of intellectual blind spot to this. Nevertheless, of course, it is a highly repressed Schedule I drug, viewed in the same category as heroin, cocaine, and what have you. This is because it has, quote-unquote, no recognized medical application. You know, I don't know. It depends on what you think of as mental health. I would argue that it's an enzyme for the imagination, without which, as the sign says on the blackboard, you're not yourself. I don't know who wrote that up there, but they must have heard an old tape of mine. This was a graffiti on a wall in Cali, in Colombia. Without this, you are not yourself. Elf, the self.